Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello, friends of Noble Mind. In this episode, Beth Kurland returns to share about her new book, You Don't Have to Change Everything. Beth teaches us how we can walk ourselves out of survival mode into a state of thriving. She describes 6 practical strategies to help learn to engage challenges constructively.
Beth Kurland is a clinical psychologist in Massachusetts with 3 decades of experience. She is also a TEDx and public speaker, a mind-body coach, and an author of 3 award-winning books. Beth blogs for Psychology Today and is the creator of the Well-Being Toolkit online program. If you are a fan of Noble Mind, you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter/X, and join our free Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/NobleMind. You can learn more about upcoming events, get our show notes, and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. Enjoy the show. Hello there. We are here with Beth Kurland, who is the author of You Don't Have to Change Everything, her newest book, and a past guest on Noble Mind as well. Welcome back, Beth.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Welcome.
Maybe you could tell our audience who didn't hear your first episode a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I practice in Massachusetts. I've been in practice now for, I think I've lost count, but over 3 decades now. And I'm a mind-body coach. I love doing public speaking and I love writing books. So I have a book that just came out here. That's my 4th book that I'm excited about. Kind of wear a lot of different hats.
Love it. That's great. Your title is excellent. It sort of gives you a sense of what's to come with you don't have to change everything. Like, oh, that's a koan for us to unpack. But maybe you could tell us what inspired you to write this particular book at this time and share with us maybe a bird's eye view of what it's all about.
Yeah. So this book emerged from a lot of different places. I think on one hand, it was a bit of a conglomeration of this over 30 years of sitting with patients and working with patients over this time, but also my own personal growth and my own personal human journey in this life, which has really evolved more and more in the realm of meditation and mindfulness through the years. So a lot of this book foundationally grew out of my meditation practice and some of the things that I've learned from that and just from mind-body practices that I've experienced and working with patients as well. After my 3rd book, I started keeping this file on my computer that I called Tools for Life. And I just started writing things down that I found helpful, either these are foundational things that really helping me or helping my patients or that I'm coming across in the literature. And so I just had this running file going. And then I also, right before and then during the pandemic, started doing these writing classes and was in writing workshops and had all of these little personal vignettes that came about through various writing prompts. And then this book kind of really emerged somewhat on its own, I want to say. I wrote it during the pandemic. And I should say that right before the pandemic hit, I had started the IMP training, the certificate for meditation and psychotherapy training through IMP, which was absolutely fabulous. And that was happening then kind of the pandemic hit as I was completing that training. And somehow everything just kind of came together with the backdrop of the pandemic and seeing how many people, I think, all of us suffering in different ways and facing this real global challenge. And really interesting as a therapist to be sitting and dealing with the very same thing my patients were dealing with, which is a bit unusual. So somehow this book just came about, and I think at its core, among many things that I think it is, it's really a way of how do we work with difficult emotions that emerge on a daily basis and, throughout our lives. And the pandemic, again, I think was just a really good backdrop and place for really delving deep myself into some of these practices. I think even in the self-help realm, or maybe especially in the self-help realm, I'm not sure, there is a sense that I need to fix myself. I need to change myself. I need to change how I'm feeling. I need to improve myself to be some, bigger, better version of me to be okay. And I think at our core, my experience sitting with people over 30 years and observing my own experience is that I think most of us have something in the background that speaks of like, not enough, not good enough, gotta do more, be more, change how I'm feeling to be okay. And so I think that message is one, or that inner dialogue is one that a lot of people can relate to on some level or other.
And in terms of seeking happiness, there's this awareness things aren't okay. I'm not okay. Uh-oh.
Yeah. I've had so many patients who sit within my office and they might be going through intense grieving of some kind, or have experienced a significant loss or just a significant life change or whatever, and feeling whatever emotions might be arising, sadness and tears or anger or whatever. And there's often I hear sense of like, oh, either apology for how they're feeling, or, oh, a sense of I shouldn't be feeling this way, or there's something wrong. There's something wrong with me. I should be happy. What's wrong with me that I'm feeling this? And so the subtitle of this book really in part speaks to that, this idea of that we, I think, often strive to be happy, but sometimes at the expense of being able to include and be with and be present to our own suffering and difficult emotions that we all experience as fellow travelers on this, life journey.
And you're right how evolutionary wiring and conditioned responses result in a way of relating to inner experience that then gets in the way of change and happiness.
Yeah, it's an interesting play here and how this happens. So I think that we're wired biologically to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And that was helpful for our Stone Age ancestors and so forth, to avoid the pain of external threats like saber-toothed tigers or poisonous snakes or the like. But the way that translates into our modern lives, we're wired to avoid our own unpleasant inner emotions and inner emotional life. And so we can do, as I see it often, one of two things, sometimes both, tend to avoid, push away, try to suppress whatever unpleasant emotions are present. Or I think on the kind of swinging to the other end of the continuum there, sometimes getting swallowed up by, triggered by, activated by whatever strong emotions might be present and engulfed in it. And both of those can have their own challenges for sure. And we know from the research that avoiding or suppressing difficult emotions in the long term often leads to unintended consequences that can affect mental health and well-being.
So when we find ourselves in that state, when we're overwhelmed, let's say, or we figure things are hopeless, then it's easy to develop the perception that we're lacking. Like, I don't seem to be able to handle this. But you're pointing out that there's a way to access actually resources that exist in that state we're not able to access. There's a lot more to us. There are all these strengths.
Yeah, remembering myself back during the pandemic with the Omicron wave that hit. And I think I was finally feeling like, things are finally coming back to maybe
Quote, back to normal.
No, yeah. And then it was like this new wave and there's all this uncertainty. What was that going to mean? And I was supposed to travel at the time, didn't know what. But that being said, what I remember is that I woke up on a particular day really feeling in a funk. And I think I had been feeling in this funk that was sort of growing during all of this. And what struck me is that happiness is not here for me right now. And when I refer to happiness, I'm really talking about hedonic happiness, the way that I think our culture often, at least the culture that I grew up in here in Eastern United States, frames it, right? So happiness was not present for me. But what I was struck by is that, and it's from all of my practice and from my meditation and mind body practices and things, that there was this deep well of well-being that was there for me to draw on, even though happiness was not there. So I think that there are some real differences, again, referring to hedonic happiness. Happiness is often dependent upon circumstances. If this happens, then I'll be happy. We have to wait for our life circumstances to change, or we wait for that external thing to happen. And happiness, again, certainly hedonic happiness, is dependent on mood. I need to feel a certain way. Whereas well-being can be there no matter what is going on. We could be going through a dark time and we can still, there are ways to call upon this deep well of well-being. We can feel sadness, or, this well-being includes all of our emotions. We don't have to feel a certain way in order to somehow access that well-being. And I also think that happiness tends to be more of a quick fix. I'm happy when I get that quick hit of dopamine, whatever it might be. I could have book sales go up and there's a sense of happiness, or, something specific happens in my life. But well-being is more of that deep well, that it can be this backdrop that can really enrich our lives no matter what we're going through.
I can relate to that experience. I think what you're describing anyway is like, I don't know, you mentioned grief a few minutes ago. Maybe that's a good example of like, maybe I'm grieving or feeling sad about something, but also at the same time, I can feel beneath that, like, I'm okay. Like, like that there's some feeling of like, of well-being as you're describing it, kind of beneath that, even though, yeah, I'm sad, or this is hard, or, this is a difficult period, or I've had a loss or something, but like on some more fundamental level, like, I'm all right. I'll be all right. I'm fine. I am fine. I don't know. The words kind of fail because they all have that sort of all or nothing kind of quality to it. It's more of a felt sense of, yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah. And I guess my experience for myself and with my patients is when we can really meet our own inner experiences and create kind of a holding environment for them. Bill and Susan Morgan use that term a lot, this container in which our deepest and sometimes most difficult emotions can be held. And there's a way in which we can see and be present to our own inner experiences. I think that's where that okayness comes from in some ways. And that's a hard place to get to. I think it certainly takes some practice, but it can be transformative.
I can imagine a listener saying, well, you folks may have inner resources, but not me.
If people feel that they don't have resources, this might also be a place where we could talk about cultivating those 6 views or vantage points in your book, because I feel like, I know when I encountered those as I was reading, it was sort of like, oh, like here are things I can do, or, like lenses I can look the world through, like as you call them, views or vantage points, that actually give me a new way of relating to them. So they are really, to me, kind of practical tools to try to help cultivate those different states.
I have a couple of different underlying premises of the book, or things that carry through. Yeah, we have our threat system, this kind of threat detection that is always on, always working. It's part of our biological wiring. And it's a good thing. It's adaptive. It helped our ancestors survive, right? And we have this process of neuroception, which, unlike perception, which we're aware of, neuroception happens below the surface of our awareness. A part of our brain and nervous system constantly scanning for cues of threat or cues of safety. And when we perceive cues of threat, or when there are more cues of threat that activate us, and when I'm talking about threat, it could be our modern day challenges, stuck in traffic, too much to do and not enough time, relationship challenges, financial stress, whatever that might be. Our stress response gets turned on, and our protection system gets activated, which tends to bring people into either a kind of fight or flight response, or sometimes a freeze response. And what tends to accompany that emotionally are things like anger, which might be more of a fight response, anxiety might be part of more of that flight, or avoidance, or even, shutting down, procrastinating, feeling stuck might be more of that freeze response. And all of these things are, again, adaptive, and we all encounter this kind of survival circuitry that gets turned on throughout our day, throughout our week, as we go through things. It's normal for us to feel this. But we also have what I call these thriving circuits, part of our newest evolutionary system, if you will, part of our social engagement system, that when our nervous system is regulated and grounded and stable and in balance, we have access to all of these inner resources that we aren't able to access when we're in more of that overdrive or threat or survival mode. And so I think people can probably relate to this just on a really simple level. If you think about being in a heated argument, or being stuck in traffic and you're late for this really important appointment or something, where there's a lot of strong emotions present. And when that happens, we often get tunnel vision. We get kind of narrow focus. It can be hard to think clearly. We might be swallowed up in our emotions. We might be fighting against them or whatever. It can be very challenging. But when we're in a state, maybe after the fact, after the argument, things cool down, the fire's cool, and all of a sudden we're able to see things differently. We have a different perspective. We can see a much bigger picture. We have more compassion maybe for our partner that we were just arguing with, right? All of these things are there, but they're just not there when we're in that survival mode. And so when each of these 6 vantage points in some ways helps our nervous system to have more cues of safety so that it can come into more balance. And as that happens, naturally, these inner resources emerge, that we are able to experience greater curiosity and connection and calmness and clarity and safety and stability. We have access to more acceptance, equanimity, perspective, and I could go on, and all these things that are also our birthright. And to be fair, some of these things are helpful to be practiced and to be strengthened as well. But each of the vantage points really allows us to activating our thriving circuits so that we can uncover what's already here.
The vantage points or the views are really the big chunk of your book here. And I'd love to hear you get into a little bit more about where that came from and what your hopes are in terms of how these will be a tool for people. My reading of it was that these are 6 ways to like jiggle how I'm thinking or something, or like a different lens to put over things, like a different pair of glasses, or, some of those metaphors for different ways of thinking, but also feeling. And some of them are more embodied as well.
Yeah.
But they really are like kind of 6 things you can like toggle through when you're dealing with life to think and feel differently and relate to your experience in different ways. But yeah, where do these come from? Where did these 6 sort of, how'd you settle on these?
I came up with some of the names and the ways of framing it, but all of this, I should say, has grown out of things that I've learned from different people and practices over the years. And a lot of it has actually grown out of my meditation practice as well. So the first vantage point, which kind of ties in with what I was talking about, the survival mode and more of the thriving mode, or being able to access more of our social engagement system that's grounded in a sense of more safety. The anchor view really speaks pretty directly to that. When I was writing the book, and especially during the pandemic, it occurred to me that we are not really taught how to meet and greet our own difficult emotions. It's just not something we're taught typically how to do at all. And in fact, I think we're taught the opposite, that often messages either directly or indirectly can tell us to put away your sadness, or let's see that smile, or look at these pictures of the people in the ad and you should be looking like that, right? So how do we meet and greet what's there? So if we're in the middle of a storm, if we're out at sea and we're thrashing about and the storm is going to sweep us away, and maybe there's a boat nearby and that boat is anchored, and that anchor, that rope runs from the boat all the way down right deep to the ocean floor. And so even though that storm is happening, if we can grab that anchor, if we could grab that rope and hold it, we're not going to be able to stop the storm, but it will help us from being swept away. And from that vantage point of the safety of the boat, we can look out and we can watch the storm. We can see that it's happening, but there's also some sense of safety and stability as this storm passes. And of course, the storm is really a metaphor for our emotions. And so what do we do when we're hit with an intense emotion? Some of this anchor view, I'm hearing Susan Morgan's voice. She's a meditation teacher, and she talks about this idea of, I'm losing her phrasing, but it's like sort of calm, breathe, settle, soothe. It's all about our first move of really calming and settling the nervous system. Because in the midst of a storm, whatever those strong emotions are, if we can soothe this organism here and whatever is happening in our nervous system, we're going to be much better equipped to face and move forward more skillfully. So the anchor view is really all about, in different ways, and pulling together some favorite ways that I've come across of helping to calm and soothe our nervous system. And I think that anchor view is foundational to everything else. And so how do we do that? One practice that goes back to a lot of ancient wisdom traditions is using the breath in a way that can be grounding for us, and really knowing or understanding a little bit about the breath and how that connects with our nervous system so that we can breathe in ways that bring our nervous system into balance. So that's just one little example.
I'm thinking also of, from self-compassion, the phrase soften, soothe, allow, which maybe helps in a moment. I know that, like, those little slogans of, okay, wait a minute, soften, soothe, allow, okay, right? Or there was another one I encountered through, I think, Kripalu Yoga. They use this phrase, breathe, relax, feel, watch, allow, which is sort of like, okay, just if I can grab that in a crisis, catch my breath, relax a little, feel what's arising, watch, observe, allow. So I think there's different models and approaches that kind of give you some, like a few words you can grab onto in a crisis. It can't be too complicated. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to remember it in the moment.
A couple of my favorite things are, one is really remembering to slow down the exhalation.
Oh, right. Like low and slow breathing.
Yeah. And what a lot of people, when you ask people to take a deep breath, people can't see me, but I'll just describe, it's kind of like that big inhalation and kind of a short exhalation. And that actually revs up the sympathetic nervous system. So if we're feeling anxious, it can actually get us a little bit more activated.
Yeah.
And so by slowing down that exhalation, it really puts the brakes on the sympathetic nervous system and has a calming effect. Breathing is just one way, but like you were saying, Kate, in terms of just short little phrases, I think even something as basic as feeling our feet on the ground.
Yeah. Like softening a little tension or something.
Yeah. And actually, I love the softening tension one. I'll sometimes do this with people. A little, like, think of something, just a typical stressor in your week. And I'll ask people to kind of slump over and tighten their muscles, just squeeze and tense everything, which of course you can't breathe too well when you do that. And say to yourself, I'm so stressed. I'm so stressed. And then keep that same thing in mind, but sit upright, relax and soften all the muscles in the body. Notice the breath coming in deeper, and hold that same stressful situation in mind and say, I'm so stressed. I'm so stressed. And like, what shifts or changes? At least for me, when I do that, it's much harder to feel the stress when my posture and my breathing and my muscle tension are in a different state.
Totally. Yeah.
And for each anchor in the book, you not only explain it, but also have audio meditations so people can delve into an experiential learning of it.
Yeah, that was fun to create those. And I really wanted to try to make this as practical as possible. So really offering people ways.
I'd love to hear about the child view, because as I was reading that one, I was like, oh,
Mm.
curiosity, playfulness, how
Mm.
nice. You don't always think of that as like a resource you can grab in a difficult moment. Or anyway, I'd love to
Yeah.
hear you tell us a little bit about the child view and where that comes from.
Yeah. And so again, in part, although not exclusively, in terms of mindfulness practice and the next meditation move after our nervous system, there's some balance there, is to begin to bring curiosity to our inner experiences. Right? That's what we often do with mindfulness meditations, like become curious about what's actually happening inside here. On another level, the fact that we are wired to push away and turn away from the unpleasant. So it does a little bit of the opposite of, cultivating this curiosity or willingness to turn towards instead of away. And as we bring curiosity, we can also begin to notice habitual patterns and behaviors and ways of being that may not always serve our well-being in the best way. So why did I call the child view? Because if you watch little babies or young children, even will take just an ordinary object and pick it up with such curiosity and amazement and like, oh, wow. Like they haven't formed a sense of aversion or likes and dislikes, but there's just this curiosity to really explore. And when we can hold that curiosity with our own inner experiences, our thoughts, our emotions, we can begin to observe things that we might not otherwise see.
I think also that when we're doing meditation or mindfulness or even just in psychotherapy or something, and people are, it is suggested that people get curious about an experience. It can feel a little like solemn, or it can feel a little like it's what you should do, or like serious in some way. And I just love this being curious like a child, specifically, like that kind of open-mindedness. And also when you show up somewhere and there's a kid, even if it's like in a store or something, and the kid looks at you and they're just like, hi,
Yeah.
you know, and just that like, I want to meet you.
There's a friendliness, right?
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
friendliness to it. And that I know is another quality you mentioned. So they're curious, but also in this kind of friendly sort of way. And there's a lack of seriousness and heaviness about it. Like sometimes that word maybe has that meaning in some practices, or ends up landing that way for people.
It's not grim.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we can disconnect from that playfulness for sure that many of us do as we get older, become adults. But that quality can be so helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And friendliness too, which you talk about as well, that we're being friendly with whatever is arising with our experience, with others. And again, thinking about that quality as something kind of childlike or like unburdened, or unencumbered, maybe another way to describe that childlike quality.
Yeah. And just a practical example to just make it concrete. And I'm thinking about during the pandemic, especially when I could remember to bring curiosity to my own inner state. I would recognize that, isn't this interesting? Here I am lying in bed in the middle of the night. Essentially, I'm safe in the safety of my home or whatever in this moment. And my mind is running away into all of these worst case scenarios. And isn't this curious that my body is tightening? All my muscles are tensing. My breath is getting shallow. I'm feeling a little panicky. And so just bringing that kind of curiosity to it and really saying to myself also, oh, interesting. Yeah, this is my survival wiring trying to protect me. And at the same time, when I can bring that curiosity to it, I could also recognize that this tension and tightening and stress response was not actually the response that was helping keeping me safe. in that moment, that even though that would have been a helpful response for an external physical threat of a saber-toothed tiger or something, it wasn't the response that maybe was bringing the most well-being for me. So just that curiosity kind of loosened the grip a little bit and could then make space for something else.
And like the other anchors, there's an opening and a connecting in a benign way to various things. So that would shift the perspective the person holds about the given situation, I imagine.
And other qualities of the child that you mentioned also are creativity, humor, silliness. So each of these views is actually like a cluster of qualities. It's not just like one thing, it's a set of things.
Yeah. And I was reflecting a lot when I was writing that about how, at least I can speak for myself, in many ways, I had disconnected from some of these qualities as a child, became more serious, and more studious and focused on school and that kind of thing. But when I could bring these qualities back into my life in different ways, they really became very supportive resources. I'm thinking of a situation with my dad and my stepmom a couple years back where they were just dealing with this flood after flood in their basement. I'll spare all the details, but they were dragging towels up and down in the middle of the night. And this went on and they couldn't fix the problem. But when I was talking to them, I was just struck one day, there was this humor about it. They were able to bring some lightheartedness to a very real stressful situation. And it just shifted the way they were able to handle what was going on. So these inner qualities can be really helpful in the midst of challenges.
Yeah, since you talked about writing this book during the pandemic and the lockdown, and there was some good dark humor that helped me get through that period. I know, once people were kind of like living in lockdown and then like joking about what it's like for them and their family or their kids, or that brings a sort of view of common humanity, but also a little perspective, because you have to kind of step back and kind of see the absurdity of it at the same time. And that can really serve to help with coping.
Yeah.
So we've covered the anchor and child views. The third one is the audience view. I wonder if you can say a few things about that.
Yeah. So that one, from the meditation practice perspective, is this idea of really the mindful view, being able to take that half step back to be the mindful witness of what's emerging, what's here. So the way that I talk about it in the book is imagining that there's a performance on stage, and it's the performance of your life or a moment of something's happening and you're sort of caught in the drama on stage. You're one of the actors on stage. And then all of a sudden, if you could imagine, instead of being the actor on stage, that you're actually the one in the audience watching the actors on stage. And when we can shift to that kind of viewing point and see that, oh, I think about it even kind of a third person shift. Actually, this happened the other day. I was getting really frustrated and heated about some silly thing, kind of storming around my house. And then there was that shift all of a sudden into the audience view. And it's like, oh, wow, I can see that Beth is getting really irritated and frustrated about this thing right now. And I can kind of see the ways that she's tensing up and how it's not really, may not be helping her move towards well-being in this moment, right? But that was me from the audience view, being able to see what was happening. And when we're able to do that, it gives us a lot more choice about how we respond versus being caught in our habitual reactions to things.
It reminds me a little bit of Defusion from ACT, right? That ability to
Yes.
step out of your experience and kind of observe it from a witnessing place or a sort of a separate place. I like talking about yourself in third person. That seems like it can't help
Yes.
but, and I know ACT uses tricks like that too. It can't help but create a little gap.
Absolutely. And for sure, that act was also another piece that influenced parts of this book. I love doing this practice with people of having them think about a situation when they might say this to themselves, something like, I'm so angry, I'm so anxious, I'm so stupid. Kind of say that, feel how that lands in the body, and then be able to shift more to this audience view and to say, I notice that I'm feeling a lot of anxiety in my body right now. I notice that a lot of anger is present in this moment, coursing through my body. I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm so stupid. And many people who have never meditated or done any of this describe that, oh yeah, I felt something different in my body. There was more space.
Right.
And that's really the audience view.
Meta-awareness.
Yeah. And how about the compassionate parent? Since we've talked a little bit about the child, we could talk a little bit about the parent too. Who is this compassionate parent? This is another one of your views. What are we cultivating here?
So ultimately, the compassionate parent is, how do we become a compassionate parent for ourselves, for our own suffering, for our own inner emotions? And I would say my experience, certainly for much of my life and from many of my patients who come in the door, that there's this really self-critical or judgmental voice that we have around our own suffering, even though we can be quite compassionate towards others. And if you think about, let's say, 3 different parents with a child who is going through something difficult, upsetting happened, something fell through, they're disappointed, and one parent who ignores the child completely, leaves the child to just kind of tantrum on their own. The second parent who kind of goes in and yells at that child, what's wrong with you? Just, hey, cut it out, put a smile on your face, wipe away those tears and knock it off. Right? The third parent who goes in and sits next to the child, maybe puts an arm around the child and says, of course you're disappointed. That was really upsetting that happened. And I'm here with you. We don't do that with ourselves very often.
Yeah.
And
many of us have not encountered that kind of parent before.
Yes. And that's a really good point. And I mean, I use the term compassionate parent, but we don't have to have had that experience. And many of us have not had that experience of our own parent, but you could substitute that for a compassionate friend or a compassionate mentor, or even a sense of a spiritual being, if that's one's inclination. But it really is a practice that if we can meet and greet our own inner distress with that kind of self-compassion, what I've seen is that it can be absolutely transformative in terms of how we then go forward, and that things begin to change in people's lives when they change the way that they relate to their own inner struggles.
And perhaps that's how we develop these aversions and resistance to unpleasant inner states in the first place, because we have not had that sort of company to model it for us.
Yeah, that is very true.
Yeah, learning to cultivate that, I think, especially if you didn't receive that, it may not come as naturally, but all the more reason to cultivate it. It's not too late for you to get compassionate parenting.
Yeah.
You just learn to give it to yourself as an adult.
Yeah, I love to do that for people, is even to have, especially people maybe who haven't had that experience as a kid, but even thinking about, if they're a parent, they might think about the love and care that they feel for their child when their child is going through something difficult, or they might think about caring for a good friend, or a good friend caring for them, and just being able to call up those felt experiences in the body is like, yeah, it is here.
Yeah.
It's there inside you. And then just learning to turn it towards ourselves more.
Yeah. How about this mirror view? We're just setting them up and knocking them down here.
Yeah.
We've got ended up going through them really well here. So yeah, what's going on with the mirror? One of your other views in the book.
Yeah, this one is a fun one.
Some of them you really look at and you're like, oh yeah, I need to learn that one. Other one you feel, I mean, I can speak for myself and say like, yeah, I'm doing okay with the anchor these days, but like, yeah, I could be more childlike or.
Yeah, they all have their benefits, I guess, in different ways. So this mirror view is really based on this negativity bias of our brain, that we tend to, as Rick Hansen says, brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. The negative experiences tend to stick with us and the positive ones slip away. And I think that's really true when it comes to how we view ourselves. And we often can see our own faults, we can see our own shortcomings and imperfections, and we can judge our own emotions and even feel like, oh, what I'm feeling, I shouldn't be feeling this way, or there's something wrong that I'm feeling this. We all can experience, I think, or most of us, at times, this sense of the whole self, HOLE, something missing, something wrong, something missing, or I'm stuck in a hole, because we're focusing on our imperfections. So the mirror view is about really holding up a mirror and being able to see our strengths as well. It's not about ignoring whatever else may be there, but it's about really mirroring back and taking in and seeing our strengths so that we can move through the world as our whole self, WHOLE. And some of this work really grew out of my early training in my internship with Dr. Robert Brooks, who talks a lot about instead of focusing on what's wrong with somebody, we focus on what's right and what's working and finding their islands of competence. And when we do this for others and can hold up a mirror for others, and I think of myself as a therapist, I kind of try to do this is hold up a mirror for my clients and really pointing out their strengths and the ways that they've been resilient and these different resources that they may have used to meet different challenges through their lifetime. And when that mirror gets held up and we can see it for ourselves, then we can really access those inner resources.
I'm thinking about how so many people unfortunately have it modeled to them, or society encourages this looking at the mirror and picking out all your faults and criticizing yourself. And it sounds like in your mirror view, you're kind of doing the opposite, right? You're
Absolutely.
reflecting back the things that are too easily overlooked about what's going well, what your strengths and capacities are.
Yeah, and how different I feel like our society would be if
Seriously.
in every workplace, bosses did that for their
Mm-hmm.
employees, and parents did that for their kids, and we did that for ourselves, and teachers did that for their students, right? If we could really just hold the mirror up and really reflect back all that was going well, how much that would shift and change.
Sounds like an alternative reality version.
I know. I'm
Sad to
working on it. I
say.
put the book out there hoping that, yeah.
And the ocean view is a good final one to wrap up with, maybe.
The ocean view kind of came from a number of different places, but I love this idea that we often think that we are like that single wave. We often have a sense of feeling alone, feeling isolated, feeling separate, the separate self. I think as human beings, we tend to feel that separateness sometimes, but especially in relation to when we encounter difficult emotions, we can often feel like I'm alone in this, or nobody else must be feeling what I'm feeling, or that kind of thing. Certainly a privilege of sitting with patients over 30 years, seeing how common our common humanity is. So rather than seeing ourselves as just this isolated wave, remembering or thinking about this idea that we are actually, that wave is part of this interconnected, vast, expansive ocean. So when we can find ways to experience that interconnectedness, it really changes. It changes a lot. And on a more simplistic level, this could refer to that interconnection with other people in our lives and with communities and finding things that are transcendent outside of us. What gives our life meaning and purpose beyond our small selves? On a larger level, and I just kind of dipped my toe into this in the water, way beyond the scope here, but this sense of more of that non-dual awareness that we can experience in the meditation practice, that separateness falls away, and a sense of this really interconnection on a different plane of consciousness.
A connection with spirituality, perhaps.
Yes.
And how might a reader work with a specific challenge and use your tools?
So in some way, any of them could be used individually, but I also see them as a little bit of a sequence. And I find myself using these sometimes in sequence, but I'll share a real quick example that I was feeling pretty immense overwhelm a few months back with everything going on in the world, as I know many, many people were and still are. And unfortunately, there's so many immense challenges in our world that this kind of overwhelm can sometimes bowl us over or swallow us up, or we might be fighting again to try to just suppress it. So in terms of seeing a sequence of this, is noticing, okay, I'm feeling this right now. And so the first move might be dropping an anchor. For me, that might be really coming back to my breath, feeling my body grounded on the stable ground and slowing down my exhalations just to come back into some balance in my nervous system, or calling up some safe place imagery or something like that. And then from there, being able to bring some of that child view, that curiosity. Oh, wow, I can see how I'm gripping. really tightly. I can start to be curious about how my mind is racing ahead, maybe to worst case scenarios that aren't actually here right now. I can see my survival circuitry getting turned on, and yet, gee, it's not maybe what's most needed right now to serve my well-being in the best way. So just being curious about what's happening inside. And then from there, that audience view is, the two go hand in hand, I think, but that stepping back, really being able to see in the audience, I can see that Beth is really struggling right now with what's happening. And of course, that's understandable. And so then now we start to bring in the compassionate parent view of like, yes, of course, what's happening in this moment is really hard to grapple with. And I'm not alone in feeling this, right? So now we begin to get that interconnection and that ocean view, and beginning to call up a sense of maybe support of people in my life and communities that I'm connected with that share my values, that offer different ways of trying to take action in the face of overwhelm. So there's that ocean view. And then the mirror view part can kind of come in the sense of maybe thinking about, yeah, how have I handled other challenges in my life? What qualities and what actions and what things have I brought to bear that have helped me experience some well-being? And maybe I just dip my toe. Maybe there's one little thing I can do for myself right now to take care of myself, to move myself in the direction of well-being. Maybe I just pick up the phone and call a friend, whatever. It could be very small, but being able to see ways that I've handled things in the past and what inner qualities I can draw on. So that's just sort of real quick.
That's great.
Moving through each of those.
And towards the end of the book, you have a nice guided practice that also kind of integrates and walks you through each one as well, which I imagine will be in the audio, for the audio that's coming too. Maybe one other thought I'll add, and we'll move towards wrapping up, but I know we've talked a fair amount about bringing these views and vantage points in when we're having difficulties, but also particularly I'm thinking of the ocean view, the child view, the audience view, really all of them, but those in particular. I feel like they're also just really supportive of wellness.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's not just like, oh, here are some things when you're having a problem that you can do, even though they're immensely useful in that way, but also life gets better when you're curious and playful and you can feel connected to everything in some way. And
yes, I love that you brought that up, because that really is a big piece, is how do we deepen our well of well-being?
Yeah.
I mean, I think fundamentally that is the focus of the book, is how do we deepen our well-being so we can draw on that well-being no matter what, the good, the bad, the ugly, the fun. And each of these vantage points helps to do that. And yes, of course, we don't have to be dealing with something difficult. And in fact, it's often easiest to cultivate these things when we're not in the face of that.
Right. That's true. Yeah. Easier to access when it's not crisis mode.
Yeah.
Even though they're all very helpful in that point as well. And also just that, noticing that tendency, going back to the beginning about the problem with striving for happiness, there is that tendency to be, how do I fix this?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, these are great tools that will be tremendously helpful, but also they're so much more useful beyond just like fixing things, but also just to help you really cultivate a way of being that's
growing resources. Yeah.
That's growing your resources. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, Beth, so people are listening, and if they're interested in this book and curious about what you have to offer, where can they go? How should they find you in the world?
Yeah, probably the easiest way is my website, and that is just bethkurland.com. So the one word, BethKurland.com. And I have lots of resources there and more information about the book and lots of other things.
Great. They'll find this book and your other books. And we'll also put a link to our previous interview with you as well. So folks can go back and listen to that one too from your previous book. Thanks so much for joining us today. And hope that you have lots of success with the book.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Take care.
It is a pleasure.
Take care.
You too. Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.